Sandra stood in the dimly lit hallway outside the courtroom, clutching the worn fabric of her coat around her shoulders as if it could protect her from the storm brewing in her mind. Her heart raced, each beat echoing like a thunderclap in her ears, drowning out the sounds of the bustling courthouse around her. She could feel the weight of every passing second pressing down on her chest. This wasn't her first encounter with life's hardships, but it was the first time she'd felt this kind of fear, a fear that stemmed from knowing how precarious her situation had become. As she pushed open the heavy wooden doors, a hush fell over the courtroom. The room was vast, and its high ceilings and rows of benches only amplified the feeling of judgment that hung thick in the air. There, at the front, sat Judge Matthews, his piercing eyes hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses that seemed to glint every time they caught the light. He was a man of few words, but of great impact, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and unwavering adherence to the law. Everyone knew him, and everyone knew he wasn't the kind to show mercy. People in this town didn't get second chances from Judge Matthews. They got sentences. Sandra's footsteps echoed loudly as she approached the bench, and she couldn't help but feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, every stare like a needle prick against her skin. Her daughter Lena, a small, bright-eyed child of just 5 years old, walked beside her, her tiny hand wrapped around her mother's fingers, seeking comfort and assurance. Lena's presence was both a blessing and a burden. Sandra wished more than anything that her daughter didn't have to witness this moment, one more reminder of how fragile their lives had become. As they reached the front, Sandra finally lifted her eyes to meet the gaze of Judge Matthews. His face was expressionless, and for a moment, it seemed like time stopped. The silence was unbearable. Sandra's hands trembled, and she fought to keep her voice steady as she introduced herself. "Good morning, Your Honor," she managed, though her voice was barely a whisper. The judge glanced at the file before him, his expression hardening. "This isn't your first ticket," he said, his voice low and devoid of sympathy. Sandra swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor," she admitted, her voice cracking. "But I've been trying. I've been doing my best." Her words felt small, like drops of rain against a hurricane. The judge didn't flinch, didn't give her any sign that he understood or cared. He simply nodded, then waited for her to continue, as if daring her to make her case. But what could she say that he hadn't heard before? She was just another person who had made a mistake, another person who had failed to follow the rules. But for Sandra, this mistake wasn't about laziness or disregard for the law. It was about survival. And standing in front of this man, who held her fate in his hands, she felt smaller than she ever had before. Sandra's life had never been easy. She grew up knowing how to stretch a dollar, to find joy in the smallest of victories, and to fight for every inch of ground she gained. But none of that could have prepared her for the challenges she faced as a single mother. 2 years ago, her husband, the love of her life, was taken from her in a tragic accident that left her not just broken-hearted, but completely alone. There was no insurance payout, no savings to fall back on, just a mountain of medical bills that seemed to grow larger every day. She didn't have the luxury of mourning. She had a daughter to feed, bills to pay, and a life that demanded more than she felt capable of giving. Each morning started long before the sun rose. Sandra would wake up at 4:30 a.m., her body aching from the few hours of sleep she managed to steal. Her first job was at a local diner, where she waited tables and poured coffee for customers who never seemed to notice her tired eyes or the way her hands trembled from exhaustion. She smiled through their complaints, bit back her frustration, and worked until her feet throbbed, When that shift ended, she'd rush home just in time to wake Lena, get her dressed, and drop her off at the daycare before starting her second job as a part-time cleaner at an office building downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it was all she had. The money she earned barely covered rent, utilities, and the mounting medical bills that lingered from her husband's accident. But the hardest part wasn't the work or the exhaustion. It was the constant feeling of being on the edge, of knowing that one small misstep could send everything crashing down. Every cent was counted, every dollar allocated, and there was never any room for error. So, when that parking ticket appeared on her windshield after a particularly frantic morning, it felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke on her. It had been a Tuesday, and Lena had woken up with a fever. Sandra was late getting to the daycare, and by the time she reached her second job, there was no parking to be found. Desperate not to lose the few hours of work that kept food on their table, she parked illegally, telling herself it would just be for a moment. But when she returned, the ticket was there, glaring at her in bold black letters. A fine she couldn't afford, a consequence she didn't have time for. Now, as she stood in front of Judge Matthews, all of those moments of struggle, fear, and desperation seemed to crash down around her. Lena, unaware of the gravity of the situation, tugged at Sandra's sleeve, her small face turned up with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, why is that man so grumpy?" she whispered, pointing at Judge Matthews. Sandra's heart sank, and she squeezed Lena's hand, willing her to stay quiet. But in that innocent question lay the truth of it all. The misunderstanding, the judgment, the impossibility of explaining a life full of struggle to someone who had never known what it was to be hungry, scared, or utterly alone. In that moment, Sandra realized that no matter what she said, no matter how hard she tried to explain, the odds were against her. And as she faced the judge, she knew she was not just fighting for herself, but for Lena, for a chance to prove that even in this unforgiving world, they still deserved a sliver of hope. Judge Matthews was notorious for being the kind of man who never bent the rules. He had earned his reputation over the years as someone who adhered strictly to the letter of the law, a man who believed that justice was best served cold, unflinching, and impartial. His courtroom was a place where facts mattered, where excuses were dismissed, and where even the faintest whiff of leniency was swiftly snuffed out. Over his years on the bench, countless people had stood before him, and most had left feeling the sting of his gavel as it came down with unwavering force. In a town that often seemed full of second chances for some, Judge Matthews was the reminder that consequences still existed for those who didn't play by the rules. Today, as he sat there staring at Sandra, his expression remained impassive. The lines on his face told a story of years spent in service to the law, and the sharpness in his eyes suggested that he had long since grown accustomed to hearing every excuse imaginable. To him, Sandra was just another person who had failed to respect the rules, and her situation was just another story in a sea of similar tales. He didn't see her as a woman struggling against insurmountable odds. He saw only the file in front of him, detailing her violations, her failure to pay the fines, and her repeated disregard for regulations. "Why should I believe that this time is any different?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that cut through the room. His question wasn't meant to invite sympathy, but rather to force Sandra into a corner, to make her admit to her mistakes without allowing her the luxury of explaining them away. As he spoke, he leaned forward, his gaze boring into her, searching for any sign of dishonesty or insincerity. Sandra felt that gaze like a weight pressing down on her, threatening to crush whatever fragile sense of hope she had left. Sandra took a breath, trying to steady herself. "Your Honor, I didn't have a choice," she began, her voice faltering. "I know that parking there was wrong, but I was desperate. I was late to work, and I couldn't afford to lose that job. I have a daughter to take care of, and everyone has a reason," Judge Matthews interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "And everyone who comes into this courtroom believes that their reason is the exception. But that's not how the law works. You chose to break it, and now you must face the consequences." His words were final, as if the matter had already been decided, as if there was nothing left for Sandra to say that could change his mind. The room fell silent once more, and Sandra felt the eyes of the courtroom burning into her back. She could sense their judgment, their pity, and worst of all, their certainty that she was about to be handed a sentence she couldn't afford. And then, just as the silence threatened to swallow her whole, Lena spoke. "Mommy, I'm hungry," she said, her voice clear and innocent, cutting through the tension like a knife. The sound was startling, breaking the rigid atmosphere of the courtroom, and for a moment, everyone seemed frozen in place, as if unsure how to respond. Sandra's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively tightened her grip on Lena's hand, trying to quiet her. But it was too late. The words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Judge Matthews blinked, his attention shifting from Sandra to the little girl standing beside her. For the first time since the hearing had begun, his expression softened, and he stared at Lena as if seeing her for the first time. Lena, unaware of the gravity of the situation, continued to look up at Judge Matthews with wide eyes. "Can we have hamburgers, Mommy?" she asked, her voice tinged with that unique blend of curiosity and innocence that only a child could possess. The question was so simple, so pure, that it seemed to strip away all the layers of formality and tension that had been building in the room. It was as if, for just a moment, everyone forgot about the parking ticket, the courtroom, and the judge's reputation. Judge Matthews leaned back in his chair, studying Lena with an intensity that no longer felt harsh or judgmental, but rather contemplative. He had seen countless cases in his time, cases involving theft, violence, and despair, but rarely had he seen such honesty, such unfiltered truth. This little girl wasn't trying to manipulate him or sway his decision. She was simply hungry, and she was unafraid to say so. "What's your name?" Judge Matthews asked, his tone softer now, as if he were speaking to his own granddaughter, rather than to the child of a woman standing trial. Lena's eyes lit up at being addressed by the judge directly. "Lena," she replied proudly, puffing out her tiny chest. "And I'm 5 years old." There was a ripple of quiet laughter throughout the courtroom, a brief moment of levity that seemed to lift the heavy atmosphere, if only for a second. "Well, Lena," Judge Matthews continued, "do you know why your mommy is here today?" He wasn't asking the question to mock or belittle, but rather to gain insight, to understand what was really happening in the lives of the people who stood before him. Lena looked thoughtful for a moment, her brow furrowing as she tried to find the right words. "Because she parked the car where she wasn't supposed to," Lena said finally, nodding as if she were explaining something very important. "But she only did it because we had to go fast, or she'd be late for work, and then we can't get food." Her explanation was simple, yet it carried with it the full weight of Sandra's struggle. The urgency, the fear, and the desperate choices that came with trying to survive in a world that often seemed stacked against them. Judge Matthews felt something stir within him, something he hadn't felt in years. He glanced back at Sandra, who stood there with tears brimming in her eyes, struggling to maintain her composure. "Your daughter seems to understand more than most adults," he said quietly. "She speaks the truth without hesitation, without hiding behind excuses or justifications." For a moment, the courtroom seemed to transform. The rigid walls, the harsh fluorescent lights, the rows of people waiting for their turn before the bench. It all faded into the background, replaced by something more human, more real. The judge saw Sandra not as a case file or a violator of the law, but as a mother, a woman trying to make it through the day without losing herself in the process. And as he looked back at Lena, he couldn't help but remember his own daughter at that age, how she'd once sat on his lap, asking for spaghetti for dinner, with the same bright eyes and hopeful smile. He had spent so many years hiding behind his role, behind the authority of his position, that he had forgotten what it meant to be human, to be fallible, to be capable of compassion. Judge Matthews continued to stare at Lena, his mind swirling with memories of his own daughter from years ago, memories that he thought he had long buried beneath the weight of his responsibilities and the countless cases he had presided over. He could see it so clearly now, those moments when he would come home late from work, exhausted and preoccupied, only to find his little girl waiting for him with a plate of cold spaghetti, her eyes filled with hope that maybe this time he'd sit down with her. He remembered how often he'd brushed her aside, telling her that he had important things to do, that his work couldn't wait, and how her eyes had dimmed just a little more each time. But Lena wasn't his daughter, and this wasn't a moment from his past that he could fix. This was happening now, right in front of him, and he felt a pang of guilt for all the times he had failed to recognize the human stories behind the cases he judged. He glanced back at Sandra, seeing the exhaustion etched into her face, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of her burdens, and the desperate hope that flickered in her eyes. He could sense that she was on the edge, that she had fought with everything she had, and that this courtroom was her last stand. For the first time in years, Judge Matthews felt his rigid sense of duty waver. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure, but the softness in his voice betrayed him. "Lena," he said, addressing the little girl once more, "do you know what your mommy does when she's at work?" "She makes food for people," Lena replied without hesitation. "And she cleans up too. She always comes home really tired." Lena's eyes grew wide with pride as she spoke, as if her mother's work was the most important thing in the world. "But she still plays with me, even when she's tired." Sandra's eyes welled with tears, and she bit her lip, trying to hold back the emotions threatening to spill over. She had worked so hard to shield Lena from the harshness of their reality, to make sure that even when things were at their worst, her daughter still felt loved and cared for. But now, here they were, exposed in front of a room full of strangers, and all Sandra could do was pray that this moment would be the one that changed everything. Judge Matthews leaned back, his eyes never leaving Lena's face. "You must be very proud of your mommy," he said softly. Lena nodded vigorously, her curls bouncing with the movement. "She's the best mommy," Lena declared, her voice ringing with certainty. "She always makes sure we have food, even if it's just peanut butter sandwiches. And she tells me stories before bed, even when she's really tired." The courtroom, which had been so still, now felt alive with the quiet hum of empathy. People shifted in their seats, their expressions softening as they took in the sight of this little girl, so full of love and admiration for her mother, despite the struggles they faced. Judge Matthews felt a lump form in his throat, and he had to swallow hard before he could speak again. "Thank you, Lena," he said gently. He turned his attention back to Sandra, who stood with her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Ms. Jenkins," he began, using her name for the first time, "it seems you've been dealt a difficult hand." Sandra looked up, surprised by the shift in his tone. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice trembling. "But I'm doing my best. I just want to give my daughter a better life." There was a long pause, the kind that made every second feel like an eternity. Judge Matthews took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He could choose to be the man he had always been, the one who followed the rules without exception, or he could be the man his daughter would have been proud of, the man who saw beyond the black and white lines of the law and found room for compassion. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, something that hadn't happened in his courtroom in years. He extracted a creep of bill and handbite to the bailiff. "Please take this young lady and her mother to the cafeteria and make sure they get a meal," he said, his voice firm despite the emotions that threatened to break through. "Something tells me they've earned it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a mix of disbelief and admiration. Judge Matthews wasn't finished. He cleared his throat again, this time turning to Sandra with a look of genuine warmth. "As for your ticket," he continued, "I'm going to dismiss the charges." There was an audible gasp, and Sandra's knees nearly buckled. She gripped Lena's hand tighter, as if to anchor herself to this moment that felt like a miracle. "But," Judge Matthews added, "this isn't just about letting you off the hook. I want you to know that there are people out there who can help you. Sometimes it feels like we're all alone in this world, but that's not true. There are organizations, programs, and people who want to help mothers like you. I'll make sure you get connected to them before you leave today." Sandra nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face. She didn't care about the courtroom, the spectators, or even the judge's reputation. All that mattered was that, for the first time in a very long time, someone saw her, truly saw her, and chose to help rather than judge. Lena looked up at Judge Matthews, her face beaming. "Thank you, Mr. Judge," she said, and the innocence in her voice broke something open in him. He managed a smile, one that felt foreign but welcome. "You're welcome, Lena," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Take care of your mommy, okay?" Lena nodded solemnly. "I will." As Sandra and Lena were led out of the courtroom, the room erupted in applause, not just for the decision, but for the humanity that had emerged in a place where it was least expected. Judge Matthews sat back in his chair, watching them go, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something akin to hope. He had always prided himself on being a man of the law, someone who didn't bend, who didn't waver. But today, he had discovered that there was something far more important than the law. There was justice. And sometimes, justice meant seeing the person standing in front of you, not just the rules they had broken. As the courtroom emptied, he sat there in silence, lost in thought, wondering how many other people he had failed to see, how many other stories he had dismissed without a second thought. And for the first time in his long career, Judge Matthews vowed to do better, to be better, to never again let the weight of his authority blind him to the humanity of those who stood before him. The news of what had transpired in Judge Matthews' courtroom spread faster than wildfire. It started with a few murmurs among those who had witnessed the scene firsthand, but soon it grew into something much larger. A local journalist who had been present that day penned an article titled, "A Judge's Moment of Compassion," which was picked up by a regional news outlet and then shared across social media platforms. The story seemed to touch a nerve with people everywhere, striking a chord with those who had long felt that the world was becoming a colder, harsher place. The article described, in vivid detail, how Judge Matthews had taken the time to listen to a single mother's struggles, how he had seen beyond the infraction and reached out to help her in a way that transcended his duty as a judge. It painted a picture of Lena, the little girl who had innocently declared her hunger, unknowingly transforming a moment of judgment into a moment of empathy. By the next morning, Sandra's story was trending on various platforms, and people from all walks of life began to share their own experiences of hardship and kindness. The narrative took on a life of its own, evolving into something more than just a tale about a mother, a daughter, and a judge. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that there were still pockets of compassion left in a world that often seemed indifferent to suffering. People commented on the story, expressing their admiration for Judge Matthews' actions, while others began sharing their own stories of unexpected kindness. A movement of sorts began to take shape, with countless individuals inspired to pay forward acts of generosity, no matter how small. As the story gained momentum, local organizations and charities took notice. One organization, dedicated to helping single mothers in financial distress, reached out to Sandra and offered her ongoing support. They provided her with food vouchers, helped her find more stable employment, and even connected her with a financial advisor who taught her how to budget and save for her and Lena's future. It wasn't just a one-time gesture. It was the start of a new chapter in her life, one where she no longer had to feel as if she was fighting a losing battle on her own. But the story didn't just change Sandra's life. It also had a profound impact on Judge Matthews. As he read the articles and watched the news segments covering what had happened in his courtroom, he found himself reflecting on his career, on all the times he had chosen to be strict rather than compassionate, on all the faces he had dismissed without a second thought. For years, he had believed that his job was to uphold the law, to enforce it without question. But now he realized that there was so much more to justice than simply following the rules. He started to take a different approach in his courtroom, listening more carefully to the people who stood before him, asking questions not just about their offenses, but about their lives, their struggles, and their dreams. He began referring more people to social services, offering advice instead of just doling out fines, and even working with local charities to create programs that could help those who were trying to rebuild their lives. He became a judge who didn't just enforce the law, but one who helped people find their way back to their feet. It wasn't an easy transition. There were moments when his colleagues questioned his decisions, moments when he doubted whether he was doing the right thing. But every time he felt himself slipping back into old habits, he thought of Lena, that bright-eyed little girl who had reminded him of the power of empathy, and he found the strength to keep going. He became known not as the judge who was feared, but as the judge who listened, and his courtroom became a place where people felt that they might actually have a chance to be heard. Sandra, too, found herself in a place she had never imagined. With the support she received, she was able to find a stable job that paid enough to cover her bills and even allowed her to save a little each month. For the first time in years, she could breathe without the constant fear of losing everything. She enrolled Lena in a better daycare and started taking classes at night to earn a certificate that would open more doors for her in the future. She was no longer just surviving. She was building a life, one that she could be proud of, one that Lena could look up to. And every night, when she tucked Lena into bed, Sandra would tell her the story of that day in the courtroom, of the kind judge who had listened to them, of how a single moment of kindness had changed everything. Lena would listen with wide eyes, and every time she'd ask, "Is he still helping people, Mommy?" And Sandra would smile, knowing that somewhere out there, Judge Matthews was doing just that. As for the judge, he found himself invited to speak at community events, asked to share his thoughts on the justice system and how it could be more compassionate, more human. He used these opportunities to advocate for change, to push for a system that didn't just punish, but also uplifted. He spoke about the importance of understanding that behind every case file was a person, someone with a story worth hearing, and he encouraged others to listen, really listen, to the people who crossed their paths. One evening, as he was preparing to leave the courthouse, Judge Matthews received a letter in the mail. It was from Sandra. Inside, there was a photo of Lena, now a year older, grinning widely as she held up a certificate from her preschool. The letter was simple but heartfelt. "Thank you for seeing us," it read. "Thank you for giving us hope." Tears welled up in the judge's eyes as he read those words, and in that moment, he understood that the greatest impact one could have wasn't in the laws they enforced or the sentences they handed down, but in the lives they touched. He realized that his role wasn't just to administer justice, but to be a force for change, to use his position to create a world where people like Sandra and Lena didn't have to feel invisible or abandoned. He took the photo of Lena and placed it on his desk, a constant reminder of the day when he chose compassion over judgment. And every time he felt the pull to revert to his old ways, he would glance at that photo, and it would remind him of the power of kindness, the importance of seeing people not as their mistakes, but as the complex, beautiful beings they were. Judge Matthews knew that he couldn't change the world overnight. He knew that there would be days when he would falter, when he would be tempted to slip back into the comfortable role of the unyielding judge. But he also knew that as long as he kept Lena's picture on his desk, as long as he remembered the way her eyes had shone with hope and innocence, he would find the strength to be the judge that people needed him to be, the judge who saw them, who heard them, and who, whenever possible, offered them a chance to start again. And in that, he found a sense of fulfillment he had never known before, a purpose that transcended the black and white world of law and order. He had learned, through the voice of a hungry child, that justice wasn't about being right. It was about doing right, and that made all the difference in the world.